Dr. RMitchell, who is the academic dean at Fisk University, as well as a professor of history at Fisk University, and Ms. LWynn, who is an adjunct professor of history at Fisk University, as well as a person who works with the Tennessee Historical Commission. Ms. Wynn, before we had our break, we were talking about some of the various groups involved in the struggle for independence. But more specifically, what we'd like to do is to give our audience some information, perhaps about the African-American population during this period.
Okay, during this period, African-Americans, and I'm not familiar with the exact percentage that they constituted of the total population, and I believe it was about 20%. They were, of course, well, I guess they sort of had ambivalent feelings in many ways. You're getting ready to go into a possible war that deals with independence, and this is also the age of enlightenment and egalitarianism. And so African Americans, who were predominantly part of the slave population, felt that, you know, perhaps this would lead to freedom for them. At the same time, they were not exactly sure how the colonists were going to treat them. And of course, the colonists did not induct them into the Revolutionary War when it first started. The British did not do it immediately, and the colonies did not do it until the British offered them entrance into their army, guaranteeing them freedom after it was over. So it was about 20,000, I believe, served in the British Army. About 5,000 served in the Continental Army. They were, after the war was over, of course, there was, you know, they found out that both groups, to some degree, had fabricated stories to them. They all were not guaranteed given the freedom that they had been promised. Some were. I'm not trying to indicate that they all were not given freedom, but some were not, and that's on both sides. Phyllis Wheatley, who is known as the first black poet in America, spoke to the issue of the revolution. And you know, Phyllis Wheatley is often perceived as being somewhat benevolent on the issue of the Revolutionary War. But she was not. She wrote a poem, and she talked, in that poem she talked about how we too as Americans want that principle, that same principle that God implanted in your breast, that we have it in our breast. And you know, we do not want the oppression. We want the principle of freedom. So it was, they had their hopes up.
That's a wonderful point, because the American population of African Americans at the time, please understand, they were experiencing the same thing everyone else was experiencing. The slave population, which, as Mrs. Wynn points out, was a majority, and the free population. I think one of the real errors in American history with regard to African Americans is the attempt to always make us one homogeneous population. You had a free black community who were just
Explain that free black community. What do you mean when you talk about free black community?
Those persons outside of the South especially, who were not enslaved, who had either bought their freedom, who had come in from England as free people, who had been given their freedom.
So not all blacks were slaves, is that what we're talking about?
Exactly, exactly. And while the three of us in our classroom activities have pointed that out, I think that's one point that's being lost on America today. I mean, just as today, not all blacks play basketball. Not all African Americans sing, and we're different. We're different. We had different experiences. When you talk about the American Revolution and independence, I think another point that's often lost is that the first person to give their lives was a person of color, a slave, a former slave named Crispus Attucks, who was upset. And what's interesting about Attucks, he wasn't carrying a banner. He wasn't expressing libertarian philosophy. He simply realized that these British soldiers, who were now in the colonies, were taking jobs from stevedores, and he was a stevedore. He didn't like the fact that British soldiers were able to work in the evening and take his job. So he challenged someone out in the street. And from that, a brawl broke out that John Adams later called the Boston Massacre. But this was a part of the experience. The other thing, I think, is that African Americans are often invisible in history, because for years African Americans weren't writing history and names weren't mentioned. People simply thought we weren't there. The point Mrs. Wynn made about the British use of African American soldiers, After the British, it was learned using African Americans. Then George Washington and those at the First and Second Continental Congress said, maybe we should use these soldiers. And if anyone's ever cared to look, there's a very famous portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware. The third man in the boat is as black as I am. You know, so we were there if anybody's cared to look. Several years ago, when they were carrying out the documentary, the Roots documentary, one of the earlier, they focused on earlier documentaries. They said, did any blacks fight in the American Revolution? Well, the names are there. Peter Salem, Salem Poor. And one of my favorite persons is Jenny Slew. What was Jenny Slew's role?
Well, Jenny Slew was involved in the Revolutionary. As a matter of fact, she served as a spy. You know, and when we talk about African American history, and then you start talking about women's history, I often tell my students that, you know, when we start dealing with women's history and black women, you know, women's history is a footnote, but black women, we're the end note. You know,
so we're almost not there.
We're almost not there, but yet we were very much involved, and we have been involved from the very beginning. You know, we carry that double burden of race as well as sex or gender, and you know, and we are there. Is taken just like with African American history. African Americans were not writing the history. Well, the women weren't writing the history, and black women were not writing the history, and that is beginning to take place, and these names are beginning to surface now.
Just as we know the white woman Deborah Sampson, who dressed up as a man, participated. Jenny Slew, a slave woman, who simply the English soldiers were talking in front of her. She went back and told the Americans. They didn't see her. She was invisible because she was a black woman.
And so there's a case that can be made that many people have been left out of the American experience. And if the Declaration of Independence has any meaning in 1996, it is incumbent upon persons like yourself, are we saying, to bring that information out. Is that what we should?
Accidentally. The Declaration of Independence became a great freedom document for African Americans. People didn't realize that. When it said all men are created equal, it wasn't talking about me. But by the mere fact that my service was needed in a war, you can't have a slave fight to free a free man. So we received freedom. The second point is that as this struggle moved on, it became a freedom document. Accidental unto itself.
And in other words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, was eventually made more than just a philosophical statement, but it really had some meaning.
And you know, another interesting point about that document is that it does not specifically mention the institution of slavery.
And when we come back after our second break, Ms. Wynn, we're going to let you elaborate upon that. And we'll be back with you following this commercial break.